Technology is the future of humanity and a path to an easier and more convenient life. Social media is a tool for improving human connection, and merging with technology is the next stage of human evolution. However, some see humanity's interaction with technology leading to a disconnected, anxious, and unconscious populace with an altered identity as the result of technology leaving its digital mark on our brains. Here to discuss these issues with me is Professor Susan Greenfield, scientist, writer, and broadcaster. Her research is focused on the treatment of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. She's a senior research fellow at Lincoln College, Oxford. She was a professor of synaptic pharmacology, and she has an interest in the neuroscience, brain science of consciousness, and the impact of technology on the brain. So for people who don't know who you are, just tell us about yourself. What kind of work do you do?
Okay. So I'm a neuroscientist, and initially I was at Oxford University, but 11 years ago I left the university and set up my own company, pioneering a novel approach to Alzheimer's disease.
That's great. So you're interested in the brain and how the brain works and how we think. So I guess my first question would be, do you believe the brain is the mind? Or, what is the brain? Is it the mind, or are they two separate entities?
Well, obviously they're two separate words, so clearly there must be some kind of distinction between them.
Yeah.
In the old days, philosophers thought the mind was some kind of airy-fairy alternative to the squalor, if you like, of the physical brain. My own take on it is the mind is anything that distinguishes a generic brain from an individual person. So I often say the mind is the personalization of the physical brain. And we know that the physical brain is highly individualized because of something called plasticity, which enables you to adapt to your environment. And the more sophisticated the species in the animal kingdom, we being the superlative example, the more we can adapt to the environment, as opposed to a goldfish who's not very good at adapting to the environment. Yeah. So I would say the mind is the personalization of the brain.
Okay. So in other words, you think what we call the mind is created by the brain or part of the brain, as opposed
mind is focusing on an aspect of the brain, which is its highly unique individualization through interaction with the outside world. So even if you're a clone, that's to say an identical twin, you're going to have a unique configured brain. That is to say a unique mind. Even though physically the brains might look the same at the microscopic level, the neurons, the brain cells, have highly specialized patterns of connections that are driven and updated and changed every moment you're alive as you interact with the environment.
That's interesting. What do you make of the idea that the brain, or rather that the mind, is completely separate from the brain, and the mind kind of creates the experience?
Well, I don't know if anyone says that, or anyone would think that nowadays, because that means there's something that isn't physical at all.
Yes.
And it's hard to envisage that. The only thing I can think of is perhaps such people are confusing that with the soul and concepts of the soul, which by definition isn't linked to the physical squalor of the three-dimensional body. But when we talk about the mind, usually it is something that is directly related to the brain. You have disorders of the mind, you have depression, you have anxiety, and these can be traced to physical changes in the brain. So when you said the mind controls it, you'd have to say what the mind was. I mean, are you talking about some disembodied entity? You're talking about waves in the ether? It's hard to imagine if you're just using a word. Yeah, so it's not really very just turn this off. It's not really I don't think a particularly helpful way of seeing things.
Okay. So my next question kind of connected into that. Do you think that I guess you would say then that consciousness comes from the brain as opposed to through the brain?
There are people called panpsychics who say the latter. But again, it's not really helpful. What do you do with that information? You just say it as a statement, and then you can't really progress it. Whereas if you, as I would believe, say that consciousness is, it's derived from the whole brain and body. It's not just the brain disembodied. If you do that, then you can start to ask questions, you can start to try and characterize things, you can try and progress an understanding of consciousness in a way that you can't. You're just halted in your tracks if you say, oh, it's coming through the ether as kind of air, as radio waves. So what? What do you then say or do? You can't say or do anything very much, whereas you can say or do quite a lot if you posit that it's coming as a result of the physical body.
So our experience of reality is the product of the way the brain processes information, which I guess asks a lot of questions about what we call reality.
Indeed, yeah.
How we experience it.
Yeah, exactly. There's something called qualia, which philosophers like to talk about, which is that the experience of, let's say, the color red that you have, how do we know what it is compared to what I have when I see red? Yeah? And obviously you can say it's the color of a tomato or it's the color of a bus or something, but that doesn't help, because the actual subjective experience that you have when you look at something red, how do you know it's the same as what I'm experiencing? So however articulate you are, or however much you know, you still can't do that. So I think that's really, so that's called qualia, and it heightens that the whole quintessence of consciousness is it's subjective.
Yeah, and I guess, it's like if you imagine, and this might sound like we're going off track here, but it's not, it's still kind of connected. If you imagine you're in a dream, and if you wanted to kind of get a fix on your reality, you might ask someone or look at some kind of information. But in a dream, everything in that world will just confirm what the dream's perspective is.
Yeah, at the time, yeah, I agree. When you wake up from a dream, it's embarrassing to think that one just accepted that as reality, and that as people morph into other people, or as you're flying, or talking to people who are long dead, things that would really challenge normal logic in the waking world are acceptable in dreams, because the reality as defined by your dream is exactly that. People can change into other things and appear and disappear and so on. And my own view of dreaming, I've written a book called A Day in the Life of the Brain, where I have a whole chapter on dreaming, is that it's not driven by external stimulation. So it's much flimsier. So the different groups of brain cells that normally coalesce, that come together to mediate different degrees of consciousness, this is very, very gentle, because there's no strong stimuli driving it. So you are having recourse to very idiosyncratic connections that are very flimsy. So I can't really go into it all now, but anyone reading might like to look at my book, A Day in the Life of the Brain. There's a chapter on dreaming and how I say just that it is a versional consciousness. But if you see consciousness as a continuum, then this would be a very shallow form of consciousness, as opposed to in the real world, when you're having a much deeper awareness of things.
Is there, in terms of what happens in the brain, is there any kind of crossover between how we experience a dream and how we experience what we call reality?
Well, I can guess that. I say that these assemblies, which are the coalitions of brain cells, that will vary in size, and according to how they vary in size, that will determine degree of consciousness. I'm suggesting that in dreaming, the assemblies are very small. And so, yes, I can suggest, I mean, it's hard to prove, but I can suggest a physical basis for that. So it's on a continuum. It's not that it's different qualitatively. It's on a quantitative basis, not a qualitative one.
What do you make of the idea that, obviously we're talking about how the brain processes information, and that can be influenced by various factors. What do you make of the idea that things like heavy metals and stuff that can cause conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? Because I know that you looked at that condition.
Well, that is the case. I mean, there's a long time ago, it was called the Garden of Quebec in Canada. There were people working with pesticides and so on. So we know that certain toxins in the environment can influence things. So yes, it's a fact. It's not the only cause of neurodegenerative diseases, but it can throw out the chemical imbalances. And metal can do that in terms of helping the reaction that forms these kind of molecular rambos called free radicals. So it's not the sole cause, but certainly environmental factors can predispose people to neurodegenerative conditions.
So if we're going to talk about social media, we can find examples of social networking in the ancient world in the form of stone tablets and papyrus leaves and scrolls, um, which kind of help us decode the social norms of the day. When we compare that to social media as we know it today, it's very different in terms of its effect on the brain and the way it can change people. What is it about social media that does that when these other forms of social networking in the past didn't?
Okay, well, other forms of social networking were done in 3 dimensions using all 5 senses. Yeah, whereas if you restrict yourself to just hearing and vision, then you are one stage removed from very important features of when you talk to someone, such as eye contact, legitimate physical touching, and so on. So, you know, a natural human reaction, the most basic form of communication is to give someone a hug.
Yeah.
And you can't do that on social media.
No.
Yeah. And if you're not doing that routinely, especially if you're young, if you haven't got someone to reassure you and help, then that will have, I think, very profound consequences.
What does social media mean for the future of human friendships and relationships?
Well, I wouldn't call them friendships. I mean, it's a different form of communication. You know, I think that, you know, you have an audience, you download, and it's not one-on-one, it's one-on-many. Yeah. I'm fascinated, and this is just a thought, by the increased prevalence of tattoos, for example. 20 years ago, tattoos only sailors had them on their forearms, saying mum or something. You know, now they're very mainstream for both genders of all ages. Yeah. And I just wonder why, because the technology of tattoos has been around for a long time. And I just can't help but draw parallels between the popularity of tattoos and the rise of social media, whether it's because people want a sense of permanence that's not given them anymore.
Yeah.
Social media. So I think that if you have your relationships predominantly or quite heavily through the screen, it's going to be very different from all generations that have gone before, where you played games together, you ate together, you hugged each other, you imagined things. It will produce a very different type of mindset.
So, I mean, it's an interesting world if you project that forward, 10, 20 years, what human interaction will look like.
Yeah, well, I wrote a novel, not that it was brilliantly received, I don't know if it's still in press, called 2121, about the future, where just that happened, and humanity had polarized into 2 groups of people. There were people that just lived in the moment, I call them the others. They just lived in front of the screen, and it was aversive to them to actually have face-to-face conversations because they were unpredictable and they couldn't handle the multi-sensory onrush of talking to a person literally right in front of them. And you just live for the sensation of the moment. And because the screen by definition has to provide, and usually does provide, strong visual stimuli and sensory stimuli, you get used to receiving rather than generating inside your own head storylines and ideas and so on. Whereas in the old days, when you're a kid, we used to say, let's make up a game. And a box would be a car or a castle, in a way that perhaps the children nowadays, they don't do that anymore because they're playing video games or they're on TikTok or whatever. And I think that will make a difference. And then in my book, the people that rebelled against that, the backlash, well, I call them the neo-Puritans, and they were people who didn't do any of the screens. They were actually, so they weren't in any way sensational. And that was why they too suffered, because they didn't give way to any emotions or in the moment living. It was much more planned with past, present, and future. So that could be one gloomy prospect, that people will polarize into those kind of types.
And I mean, we saw the effects during the COVID era of masking and social distancing, and how young children were kind of, as a result of, they would meet another child out and about and they didn't know how to interact with them.
Sure. Yeah.
And I guess you could look at that and say, will that happen with young children's addiction to technology?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's in our hands to do something about it. It's in our hands. So someone once said, we shouldn't ask what's going to happen in the future. We should ask, how can we shape the future? The computers haven't got minds of their own. It's for parents and teachers and us in society generally. We need to work out what kind of society we want, what kind of people we want young people to be, what kind of education we think will best help them and give them confidence and resilience. And we have to ask those kind of questions. It's not going to just spontaneously ensue, you know?
Yeah. What does the role of social media mean for the rise of narcissism in society? Because that's another
Yeah, well, I think that's a big one. I mean, the very term, when I first heard ages ago, selfies, it sounded a bad thing because I was brought up in my generation that being selfish and self-centered was the worst thing. To show off was the worst thing, yeah. And my mum's generation, which is a wartime generation, they were much more altruistic and helpful and worked collectively. And anyone that just said it was all about them and talked about themselves would have quickly been put in their place, yeah. Now it's the norm to see the world solipsistically, you know, to see the world as though you are the center of it and everything relates to you and it's all about you. And I do find that deeply repugnant, actually, because such individuals who are so self-obsessed are not going to make the world a better place. They're just going to be perpetual victims.
Yeah. Focused on their own concerns rather than...
That's right. Yeah. Or blaming outside world, but not proactively driving things and making things happen. Yeah.
And there's a lot of complaining on social media.
Yeah. So, well, again, it's whereas, you know, my mum was bombed every night and there's no point in complaining. Just got up and, you know, waded through the rubble. You didn't know if your house was standing, if your friends were dead, but you went to work and there was no skinny lattice or flat whites or PTSD or people to tell you that, you know. So I think we are becoming perhaps far less confident than we were, far less resilient than we were. And if I ruled the world, I'd like to try and help children. You can't protect them because everyone in life has medical or financial or personal or professional problems. Everyone has. Yeah. I mean, even Kate Middleton now, heavens bless her, you know, she's got cancer. You know, so everyone, however grand or seemingly privileged, will have some kind of demons they have to contend with. And I don't think you're doing people a service if you isolate them from that or protect them. You have to help people be strong and deal with it. Yeah?
And one of the products of the kind of shallow nature of social media, of the self-obsessed nature, is instant gratification, isn't it? And it presents quite a concern for the value of what people focus on, because if something gets a lot of attention today, then it's immediately replaced by something else tomorrow. You have to wonder if it has any value at all.
Yeah, and it's an old adage that you only appreciate something you've had to work for, that's hard. You know, the idea of saving up money for something, you know, if it's just given to you. If it's not hard, if you haven't had to work for it or save for it, if it's just automatically dropped in your lap, you're not going to appreciate it in the same way as if you'd saved for something for a long time. And that applies to a lot of society now. And again, when I was a kid, for instance, say something simple like photographs, you'd have to take your film to the chemist, wait a week for it to be developed, and then you'd see, and half of them, you know, were blurred or decapitated or something. But those photos were very, very valuable, very precious, because you'd had to wait a week for them. There's only a few of them. Some hadn't come out, and you'd put them in your album, and look at them. Now photos are taken just as easy as breathing and have no value. No one ever sees them anymore, you know. And I think that's an example of it. Or writing letters. Again, in my parents' generation, you'd write physical letters and you'd keep them. They'd be very special. You'd keep them in a pile tied up with ribbon and look at them from time to time. Now emails and text messages are just here today, gone tomorrow. Yeah. So there's certain things that in previous generations, just because they were hard to do and you had to wait, had a value that nowadays things don't have.
To play devil's advocate, I mean, what just going on from that, what about people who say that technology is just making things easier and more convenient? Where's the problem?
Well, where do we start with that one? Well, okay, let me be. Why should life be just about things made easy? What you're going to do with all this spare time? So let's take, you know, that it saves you doing this and that, and you can do so. Why do you want to save time? What are you going to do with your time? I'd like to first challenge people. You know, what's so special about your time? You're just going to do TikTok or something? That's not very, you know, is that why we're on this planet? No. And although technology makes certain workaday things possibly less time consuming, there are elements to things that are time consuming are beneficial. For example, people like gardening or cooking. Now, if you had technology saying, well, I've got this new technology, you don't have to do any more gardening. Press a button and your garden will suddenly be in full bloom. Press a button, you'll suddenly have a 5-course, you know, cordon bleu meal. You don't have to do anything. I wonder if that would be appealing to people. I wonder, so sometimes it's not such the end product, it's the process of doing it that is valuable and important and pleasurable.
Yeah. Another kind of consequence of the very instant nature of, of taking photos and stuff is people look at Instagram and Facebook photos and they see people looking so happy and, they're like,
yeah, that's
and
that's another
they
really.
feel inferior in comparison.
Well, it's especially with young teenage girls, as we all know, that people talk about the increase in mental illness, especially among adolescents, and I think it has in some part to be connected to people being set ridiculous ideals of what they should look like and be like.
Yeah.
And it's rather sad. The most exciting thing is to be yourself and to be a unique individual in every. And if instead you're worried about, what your face looks like, or if you look like Beyonce or not, it just, I find that deeply sad that people are not promoting their own individuality and what they can do well and what they enjoy, rather than wanting to impress other people. I think a lot of people now are living their lives to impress others, hence endless photos and recordings and downloads to this ever voracious audience of so-called friends, who are constantly there commenting. I think that has to have a bad effect on your psyche. It has to.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think, that is probably one of the biggest causes of mental health problems is social media.
Of course, yeah. Well, you can't escape it. I mean, people have always, sadly, there's always been bullies in the world, but you could always go away from them. You could go home, and be away. But now it's 24/7 for people.
Yeah.
And especially when you're young, you haven't got the resilience and the life experiences that someone like I might have, of having had where you can see things in proportion, you can put things in context. If you're very young, you don't have that context yet. You haven't experienced enough to be able to make comparisons or have frames of reference. You just react to it,
And going on from making things, technology making things easy, we were just talking about, people face problems in the real world, in their real life, and it's almost like I guess you could talk about it maybe as like a coping mechanism. People just, switch off the world and look at their phone or look at their laptop. And
I notice, and the number of people, if you're on the train, everyone has their phone out.
Yeah.
Everyone. And it's almost as if it's an excuse to drop out of interaction with other people, or to not look out the train window and just have a think, and just see the landscape and just reflect on things. It gives you an instant cop-out or excuse not to interact with the outside world. And I find that sad again, because if you keep doing that, you're not going to be very good at interacting with the outside world, because you're only good at what you rehearse, and if you're not rehearsing face-to-face communication, if you're not rehearsing long attention spans and reflection, if you're constantly just doing what, Fruit Crush or whatever that game is on the phones, I don't know, or something like that, Candy Crush, that is, I think that human beings are better than that, I think if the ancient Greeks came back and saw us now doing Candy Crush or whatever, they'd feel let down after all the ideas of, what makes a person special. And it just is a shame. And I think it's our own fault. We should intervene. We should start. It's not going to automatically change. We have to have conversations like this, and people have to think about what they really want out of life.
The art of conversation is being destroyed by technology, isn't it?
Oh, completely, because it's normally done as what is offline a lot of the time, so you're not looking at the person in the face. And the whole point of conversation is that on the whole, you listen to what someone else has said and you respond, and then you process it, and all in real time. And you also affect a certain interest in other people that just talk about themselves all the time and not very good company, whereas you can do that online a lot.
And I guess if people are focused on technology, as you said, they're not thinking, they're not pondering, and
no, you're just reacting to something.
And so, I mean, I guess the brain is like a muscle. If you don't use certain parts of it, then those parts don't work.
You're only good at what you rehearse and what you do.
And so I guess that means, what does that kind of mean for the ability of people to think and have kind of deep introspection and deep
exactly so.
thoughts about the world and stuff?
And if you're just thinking, my own suggestion has been, and then I think I need to go after this, but I'll leave you with this thought, that it's not that we're going to become like computers, as some people think. We're not going to become like robots. I think we're in danger of becoming or staying like volatile 3-year-old children. You know, we're going to end up very solipsistic, highly emotional, not very reflective, rather self-centered, socially maladjusted, and living in the moment like a naughty 3-year-old.
Yeah, that's a
So okay, so
very interesting
well,
way
thank
to
you
end
very
it.
much. Thank you very much, Jane. On that,
Thank you. Yeah, that's been very interesting. Thank you.
okay, all the best. And if I can put it on my website, that would be great.
Oh yeah, I'll send it to you. Yeah.
You could send it. That'd be really helpful. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Take care. Bye bye.